Maria Elena Whitehorse pressed her fingers against the purple bruise blooming across her left cheek, wincing as the tender skin protested. The mirror in the gas station bathroom reflected a woman she barely recognized anymore. Dark circles shadowed her once bright eyes, and her long black hair hung limp around her shoulders, no longer braided with the pride her grandmother had taught her. She turned on the cold water tap and cupped the icy liquid in her palms, splashing it against her face. The shock helped clear her mind, if only for a moment. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jake's voice growing louder as he argued with the cashier about the price of cigarettes. His anger was always simmering just beneath the surface these days, ready to boil over at the smallest provocation. The drive from Phoenix had been tense, filled with Jake's complaints about her family, her heritage, and everything else that seemed to irritate him lately. Maria Elena had learned to stay quiet during these rants, knowing that any response would only fuel his rage. But the silence was eating away at her, piece by piece. She remembered the woman she used to be before Jake. Her grandmother, Ayanna, had named her after the stars that danced across the desert sky the night she was born. Ayanna had told her stories of their Apache ancestors, warriors who never bowed to anyone, who fought with the fury of thunderstorms and the wisdom of ancient mountains. Those stories felt like distant dreams now. The bathroom door rattled as someone tried to enter. Maria Elena quickly dried her face and unlocked the door, stepping aside as a tired-looking trucker nodded his thanks. She walked back toward Jake's pickup truck, her boots crunching on the gravel parking lot. The Arizona sun was beginning to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the sacred fires her grandmother used to tend. Jake was leaning against the truck, smoking and staring at his phone. He looked up as she approached, his blue eyes scanning her face with the calculating look she had come to dread. "You look like hell," he said, not bothering to lower his voice despite the other customers nearby. "Maybe if you didn't cry so much, you wouldn't look so ugly." Maria Elena felt something stir deep inside her chest, a flicker of the fire that had once burned bright in her heart. She pushed it down as she had learned to do. "I'm fine," she said quietly, reaching for the passenger door handle. Jake grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the tender skin where yesterday's bruises were still healing. "Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you," he hissed. His grip tightened and Maria Elena bit her lip to keep from crying out. She could feel the eyes of other travelers on them, but no one moved to intervene. They never did. "You're hurting me," she whispered, trying to pull her arm free. "Good," Jake replied, but he released her with a shove that sent her stumbling against the truck. "Get in. We're burning daylight and I want to get to your grandmother's place before it's completely dark." Maria Elena climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she fastened her seatbelt. They were driving to see Ayanna, something Jake had insisted on despite his usual complaints about her family. He claimed he wanted to set some boundaries with the old woman, though Maria Elena suspected his motives were far less noble. As they pulled back onto the highway, the desert stretched endlessly before them, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels against the darkening sky. Maria Elena pressed her forehead against the cool window glass and watched the landscape blur past. This was her homeland, the place where her ancestors had roamed free for countless generations. Yet she felt more trapped than ever. Jake turned up the radio, some country song about a man who couldn't be tamed, and began singing along off-key. The irony wasn't lost on Maria Elena. He demanded complete control over every aspect of her life while singing about freedom and rebellion. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's voice. The way Ayanna would tell stories about the old days when their people were warriors and healers, protectors of the land and guardians of ancient wisdom. The memory was interrupted by Jake's hand on her thigh, squeezing hard enough to leave marks. "You better not embarrass me in front of your grandmother," he warned. "I don't want to hear any of that mystical Indian nonsense while we're there. You tell her we're getting married and she better be happy about it." Maria Elena's stomach churned. They had talked about marriage before, but it had never felt like a celebration or a choice. With Jake, everything was a demand, a requirement, a way to further cement his control over her life. She nodded without speaking, knowing that any protest would only make things worse. The truck ate up the miles toward the reservation, toward the small house where Ayanna lived alone, tending her garden and keeping the old traditions alive. Maria Elena hadn't seen her grandmother in 6 months, Not since Jake had decided that her family was a bad influence on her. The isolation had been one of his most effective weapons, cutting her off from the people who loved her and might help her see clearly. As they drove deeper into Apache country, something began to shift inside Maria Elena. The familiar red rocks and vast skies seemed to whisper her name, calling to the part of her that Jake had tried so hard to destroy. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice on the wind, reminding her of who she really was beneath all the fear and bruises. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving them in the purple twilight of the desert evening. Stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had guided her ancestors across this harsh and beautiful land. Maria Elena felt a small spark of something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. She didn't know it yet, but this journey to see Ayana would change everything. The blood of warriors flowed in her veins, and some fires, no matter how long they're buried, never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to blaze back to life, burning away everything that tries to contain them. The pickup truck continued its journey through the darkness, carrying a broken woman toward her destiny and a man toward his reckoning. The familiar sound of gravel crunching under tires announced their arrival at Ayana's modest adobe house. Maria Elena's heart raced as she saw the warm glow spilling from the windows, the same comforting light that had welcomed her home countless times during her childhood. Wind chimes made from old silver dollars and turquoise stones danced gently on the front porch, creating a soft melody that competed with Jake's grumbling as he parked the truck. "This place looks like a dump," Jake muttered, surveying the small house with its traditional flat roof and weathered wooden door. "How does the old lady even survive out here without neighbors?" Maria Elena bit back her response. To Jake, everything that wasn't shiny and new was worthless, but this house held generations of memories and love. Her great-grandfather had built it with his own hands, using clay from the sacred hills and wood from trees that had grown for centuries. Every stone in the garden, every plant carefully tended by Ayana's weathered hands had meaning and purpose. The front door opened before they could knock, and Ayana stepped onto the porch. Even at 78, she moved with the grace of a much younger woman, her silver hair braided with small feathers and beads that caught the porch light. Her dark eyes, so much like Maria Elena's own, took in everything at once: the bruises poorly hidden by makeup, the way her granddaughter hunched her shoulders, the aggressive stance of the man beside her. "My little star," Ayana said softly, using the pet name she had given Maria Elena as a child. "You look tired. Come, I have tea ready." Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between the two women. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I'm Jake Morrison. I've been meaning to meet you for a long time." His voice carried false charm, the same tone he used when he wanted something from someone. Ayana's expression didn't change, but Maria Elena noticed how her grandmother's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, touching the small medicine bag she always wore around her neck. "I know who you are," the older woman replied simply. "The desert speaks of many things." The comment clearly irritated Jake, though he tried to hide it behind a forced smile. "Right, well, Maria and I have some news to share with you. We're getting married." The words hung in the air like a curse. Maria Elena watched her grandmother's face, searching for any sign of judgment or disappointment. Instead, she saw something that surprised her deep, quiet understanding, as if Ayana had been expecting this moment. "Congratulations," Ayana said, her voice neutral. "Please come inside. The night air carries whispers that are not meant for open ears." They followed her into the house, where the familiar scents of sage, cedar, and her grandmother's special tea blend enveloped Maria Elena like a protective embrace. The living room was exactly as she remembered it, filled with hand-woven rugs, pottery made by local artisans, and photographs spanning decades of family history. Jake looked around with barely concealed disdain, his eyes lingering on the traditional Apache artifacts that decorated the walls. "So this is where Maria gets all her weird ideas about spirits and nature," he said, settling heavily onto the worn leather couch. "I've been trying to help her move past all that superstitious stuff." Ayana poured tea from a clay pot, her movements deliberate and calming. "Superstition is just wisdom that hasn't been understood yet," she replied, handing Maria Elena a cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Some knowledge runs deeper than what can be seen with the eyes." Maria Elena accepted the tea gratefully, recognizing the blend immediately. It was her grandmother's special mixture, made with herbs that grew wild in the mountains. plants that the Apache had used for healing and clarity for thousands of years. The warm liquid seemed to spread through her body, awakening parts of herself that had been sleeping. Jake refused the offered cup with a wave of his hand. "I don't drink that herbal nonsense." "You got any beer?" "I do not keep alcohol in my home," Ayana said simply. "It has caused enough pain for our people." The tension in the room grew thicker. Jake's jaw tightened and Maria Elena recognized the warning signs. She quickly set down her tea and moved closer to him, hoping to prevent an outburst. "Jake, maybe you should let me handle this," he snapped, grabbing her wrist again. This time he didn't try to hide his aggression from Ayana. "Your granddaughter has a problem with keeping her mouth shut when men are talking." Ayana's eyes flashed, and for a moment Maria Elena saw something ancient and powerful stir in the older woman's gaze. The room seemed to grow colder, and the flames in the fireplace flickered despite the absence of any wind. "In Apache tradition," Ayana said slowly, "women are the keepers of wisdom and the heart of the family. A man who silences a woman's voice cuts out his own soul." Jake laughed harshly. "Well, we're not living in the Stone Age anymore, are we? Maria needs to learn her place in the modern world." "And what place is that?" Ayana's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "By my side, supporting me, doing what I tell her to do. That's how marriages work." Jake's grip on Maria Elena's wrist tightened until she winced. "Right, baby?" Maria Elena found herself caught between two worlds, the life of fear and submission that Jake had created for her, and the strength and dignity that flowed through her grandmother's veins like an underground river. She looked into Ayana's eyes and saw encouragement, understanding, and something else, a promise. "Yes," she whispered, hating herself for the words but knowing that defiance now would only lead to violence later. Ayana nodded slowly as if she understood the game being played. "Would you like to see the garden?" she asked. "The night blooming cereus is flowering. It only happens once a year, and tonight may be the night." Jake waved dismissively. "I'm not interested in flowers. Maria and I need to get back on the road soon anyway. We just came to tell you about the engagement and to set some ground rules." "Ground rules?" Ayana's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yeah, Maria won't be visiting as much anymore. She needs to focus on our relationship and our future together, and I don't want you filling her head with any more of that Indian mysticism. She's going to be a modern woman, not some throwback to the past." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind chimes outside seemed to still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Maria Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned that crying only made Jake angrier. Ayana stood slowly, her movements deliberate and dignified. "I see," she said simply. "In that case, perhaps Maria Elena should come with me to see the cereus. It may be her last chance for a very long time." Before Jake could object, Ayana had taken Maria Elena's hand and was leading her toward the back door. "We will only be a moment," she called over her shoulder. "The desert has something to show her." As they stepped into the moonlit garden, Maria Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked tight, suddenly creaking open. The night air was cool against her bruised skin, and overhead, the stars blazed with an intensity that seemed to reach directly into her soul. "Grandmama," she whispered, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in years. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Ayana squeezed her hand gently. "The night-blooming cereus waits all year for its moment to shine," she said softly. "But when that moment comes, nothing in the world can stop it from blooming." In the moonlit garden, Ayana led Maria Elena past rows of carefully tended plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The old woman moved with purpose, her feet silent on the packed earth paths that wound between medicine plants and sacred herbs. Behind them, through the kitchen window, they could see Jake pacing restlessly, his phone pressed to his ear as he made what sounded like an angry call. "He will not follow us here," Ayana said quietly, as if reading her granddaughter's thoughts. "This place holds protections that men like him cannot cross." They stopped before a large, ungainly cactus that looked unremarkable in the darkness. But as Maria Elena's eyes adjusted, she saw the miracle her grandmother had promised. A single enormous white flower was beginning to unfurl from the plant's thorny stem, its petals opening slowly like a prayer being whispered to the stars. "The Queen of the Night," Ayana murmured, her weathered hand resting gently on Maria Elena's shoulder. "She blooms only once a year and only for one night. By morning she will be gone. But tonight she is the most beautiful thing in all the desert." Maria Elena stared at the flower, transfixed. Something about its courage in the face of such brief existence stirred emotions she had buried deep inside herself. Tears she had been holding back for months began to flow freely down her cheeks. "I'm so ashamed, Grandmama," she whispered. "I've let him break me into pieces. I don't even know who I am anymore." Ayana turned to face her granddaughter fully, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "You are the daughter of warriors. You are the granddaughter of medicine women. You carry the blood of those who never surrendered, even when the cavalry came with guns and lies." Her voice was gentle but firm. One man's cruelty cannot erase 1,000 generations of strength. "But look at me." Maria Elena gestured to her bruised face, her trembling hands. "I can't even stand up to him. Every time I try to speak, he hurts me worse. I've become exactly what he wanted, a broken thing that does whatever he says." Ayana reached into the folds of her traditional dress and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight. It was an arrowhead, ancient and perfectly crafted, attached to a leather cord. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Nalnish. She was a warrior woman who fought alongside Geronimo when the soldiers came to take our people to the reservations. She hid in these very mountains for 3 years, never captured, never broken." She placed the arrowhead in Maria Elena's palm, closing her granddaughter's fingers around it. "Nalnish understood something that you have forgotten. Sometimes the strongest warriors are those who know when to retreat, when to gather their strength, when to wait for the right moment to strike." The ancient stone felt warm against Maria Elena's skin, as if it held the heat of all the hands that had touched it before hers. For a moment she could almost see her ancestor, a fierce woman with eyes like her own, moving like shadow through the desert landscape, free and untamed. "I tried to leave him once," Maria Elena admitted, her voice barely audible. 6 months ago when he broke my ribs. I packed a bag and drove to Phoenix, but he found me at my friend's apartment. He said if I ever tried to leave again, he would kill me and then kill you. I couldn't risk your life, Grandmama." Ayana nodded slowly, her expression grave. "Fear is a powerful chain. But chains can be broken, little star. The question is whether you are ready to remember who you really are." Behind them, Jake's voice grew louder as his phone conversation became more heated. They could hear him cursing someone, possibly about money or work. His anger was always close to the surface, ready to spill over onto whoever was nearest. "Tell me about the old stories," Maria Elena said suddenly. "The ones about the spirit warriors." A smile crossed Ayana's weathered face. "You always loved those stories when you were small. You would sit by the fire and listen with such serious eyes as if you were memorizing every word." "I was. I just forgot how to hear them." Ayana began to speak in the old language, her voice taking on the rhythm of traditional storytelling. Even though Maria Elena's understanding of Apache was rusty, the words seemed to bypass her mind and speak directly to her heart. She told of warriors who could move without sound, who could call upon the spirits of the land for protection, who could become one with the shadows and the wind. But the greatest power, Ayana continued, switching back to English, was always patience. Our ancestors survived because they knew how to wait, how to watch, how to prepare. They knew that the right moment would always come, and when it did, they would be ready. The night-blooming Sirius had opened completely now, its white petals spread wide like arms embracing the darkness. Its sweet fragrance filled the air, attracting moths that danced around it in slow, hypnotic circles. "What are you telling me, Grandmama?" "I am telling you that the blood in your veins is older and stronger than his anger. I am telling you that your ancestors are watching, waiting for you to remember your power. I am telling you that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who underestimate the quiet ones." A crash from inside the house made them both turn. Through the window they could see Jake sweeping items off the kitchen table in a rage. His phone call had apparently not gone well. "I should go back in," Maria Elena said, fear creeping back into her voice. "If he gets too angry—" "Yes," Ayana agreed. "Go back. But take this with you." She pressed a small cloth pouch into Maria Elena's hand along with the arrowhead. "Herbs for protection and clarity. Brew them into tea when you need strength. And remember this night, this flower, this conversation. Some things cannot be taken from you, no matter how hard they try." As they walked back toward the house, Ayana spoke quietly. "There is an old saying among our people. The mountain does not move for the wind, but the wind carves the mountain nonetheless. Be patient, little star. Your time is coming." Jake was standing by the front door when they entered, his face flushed with anger. Where the hell have you been? I've been waiting for 20 minutes. We were looking at flowers, Maria Elena said softly, quickly hiding the items her grandmother had given her in her jacket pocket. Flowers. Jesus Christ, Maria. Sometimes I think you're as crazy as your grandmother. He grabbed her arm roughly. We're leaving now. Ayana stepped forward, her presence suddenly seeming larger, more formidable. Before you go, she said calmly, I have something for you as well, Mr. Morrison. Jake looked suspicious. I don't want any of your Indian trinkets. It is not a trinket. It is advice. Ayana's voice carried a weight that made even Jake pause. The desert has many ways of protecting its children. Some are gentle, like the rain that comes to heal the earth. Others are fierce, like the flash floods that carve new canyons overnight. A wise man learns to recognize the difference. Jake stared at her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if he had been threatened or simply given some mystical nonsense he could dismiss. Finally, he laughed harshly. Thanks for the weather report, old lady. Come on, Maria. We're getting out of this crazy place. As they reached the truck, Maria Elena turned back to see her grandmother standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light of the house. Ayana raised one hand in farewell, and Maria Elena felt the arrowhead pulse against her palm like a heartbeat. The drive away from the reservation began in tense silence, but Maria Elena no longer felt entirely alone. The desert stretched around them, vast and patient, and she could almost hear it whispering promises of ancient strength and timeless endurance. Something had changed in that moonlit garden, something Jake couldn't see or understand. The night-blooming Sirius would wither by dawn, but its moment of perfect beauty would be remembered, and sometimes Maria Elena realized one perfect moment of truth was enough to change everything that came after. The weeks following their visit to Ayana passed like a slow-burning fever. Maria Elena returned to her daily routine of walking on eggshells, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. The arrowhead hung hidden beneath her clothes, a constant reminder of the strength that flowed in her blood, while the protective herbs remained carefully concealed in her bedroom, brewing into tea during the quiet moments when Jake was at work. Each cup of her grandmother's medicine tea brought back fragments of forgotten memories. She began to recall the stories Ayana had told her as a child about women who could move like ghosts, who could read the signs in nature, who could call upon the spirit world for protection. What had once seemed like fairy tales now felt like instruction manuals. Jake's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the days passed. His phone calls became more frequent and more secretive, often taking him outside where his angry voice would carry through the thin walls of their apartment. Money seemed to be a constant source of stress, and Maria Elena began to notice him drinking earlier in the day, his eyes carrying a desperate edge that made her skin crawl. One evening, as autumn painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jake received a call that changed everything. Maria Elena was in the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner and sipping her grandmother's tea, when she heard his voice explode in a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. What do you mean the deal fell through? I already spent that money. His voice cracked with panic. You don't understand, I owe some very dangerous people, and they're not the type to accept late payments. Maria Elena moved closer to the window, using her reflection in the glass to watch Jake pace the parking lot. His hands shook as he lit cigarette after cigarette, his usual swagger replaced by the hunched posture of a hunted animal. I need more time, he pleaded into the phone. Just another week, maybe two. I can make this right, I swear. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, Jake's voice cycling through anger, desperation, and barely controlled fear. When he finally came back inside, his face was pale beneath his tan, and his eyes held a wildness that made Maria Elena's stomach clench with dread. We need to talk, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. Sit down. Maria Elena perched on the edge of the couch, every instinct screaming danger. The arrowhead seemed to grow warm against her chest, and she found herself silently calling upon her ancestors for strength. I'm in some trouble, Jake began, running his hands through his hair. Business trouble. The kind that could get us both hurt if I don't handle it right. What kind of trouble? Maria Elena asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew. Gambling debts. Bad investments. Look, the details don't matter. What matters is that I need money and I need it fast. His eyes fixed on hers with laser intensity. Your grandmother has money. That land she lives on is worth a fortune to developers. All we have to do is convince her to sell. The blood in Maria Elena's veins turned to ice. She'll never sell. That land has been in our family for generations. It's sacred to our people. Jake's facade of calm cracked slightly. Then we'll have to find another way to convince her. You're her only family, right? Her heir? The implication hung in the air like a poisonous snake ready to strike. Maria Elena felt a familiar fear creep up her spine, but underneath it, something else was growing. The quiet rage of a cornered animal, the fury of someone who had endured too much and would endure no more. You're talking about my grandmother, she said carefully. The woman who raised me, who loves me. I'm talking about survival, Jake snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. You think those men I owe money to care about your family history? You think they'll stop at hurting just me when they can't get their money back? He moved closer, and Maria Elena could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the red rimming his eyes. Here's what's going to happen. We're going back to visit your precious grandmother next weekend. You're going to convince her to sign over that land, or I'm going to convince her myself. And trust me, my methods are a lot less pleasant than yours. I won't do it, Maria Elena said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, stars exploding across her vision as the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. But instead of the usual crushing despair, she felt something else entirely, a cold, calculating fury that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath her feet. You'll do exactly what I tell you, Jake snarled, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. Because if you don't, I'll make sure the old lady has an accident. Maybe a fall down some stairs, maybe a fire in that old house of hers. These things happen to elderly people living alone in the middle of nowhere. Maria Elena stared into his eyes and saw the truth there. He wasn't bluffing. He was desperate enough and cruel enough to hurt an innocent old woman to save his own skin. The man she had once thought she loved had become a monster, and she had been feeding that monster with her fear and compliance. That night, after Jake had passed out drunk on the couch, Maria Elena sat by the window and brewed another cup of her grandmother's tea. As the herbs steeped, she closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to the stories Ayana had told her. Stories of warriors who protected their people, who struck from the shadows, who used patience and cunning to defeat enemies much stronger than themselves. She thought about the night blooming Sirius, how it waited an entire year for its moment of perfect beauty. She thought about her great-great-grandmother Naalnish, who had eluded capture for 3 years, moving like a ghost through the very mountains that surrounded her grandmother's home. The tea was bitter on her tongue, but it seemed to clear her mind and strengthen her resolve. She pulled out her phone and stared at her grandmother's number for a long time, before finally typing a simple text message. The Sirius was beautiful. Thank you for showing me. The response came quickly, despite the late hour. Even in darkness, some flowers know when it is time to bloom. Maria Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. Her grandmother understood. Ayana had always understood, even when Maria Elena herself had been too broken to see clearly. The old woman had given her more than protective herbs and family heirlooms that night in the garden. She had given her permission to remember who she really was. Over the next few days, Maria Elena began to make careful preparations. She researched women's shelters in other states, memorized the locations of bus stations and train depots. She quietly gathered important documents, hiding them in places Jake would never think to look. She studied his routines, noting when he left for work, when he made his panicked phone calls, when he was most likely to be distracted. But most importantly, she began to plan for the confrontation she knew was coming. Jake's desperation was growing by the day, and soon he would make good on his threat to visit Ayana. When that happened, Maria Elena would be ready. The blood of warriors flowed in her veins, and warriors protected their own. She started making lists, studying maps of the reservation, remembering every trail and hiding place from her childhood visits to her grandmother's home. The desert that had once seemed vast and empty now revealed itself as an ally, full of secret places and ancient wisdom. Jake noticed none of these preparations. His focus had narrowed to his own problems, his own fears, his own desperate schemes. He saw Maria Elena as he always had, as a possession, a tool to be used for his purposes. He had no idea that the broken woman he thought he controlled was quietly transforming into something far more dangerous, something that carried the patience of the mountains and the fury of the storm. The call came on a Thursday morning while Jake was pacing the apartment like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued with someone about payment extensions. Maria Elena pretended to fold laundry while listening to every word, her heart sinking as she realized his situation had grown even more desperate. Friday night? Jake's voice cracked. That's impossible. I told you I need more time. The voice on the other end was loud enough for Maria Elena to hear snatches of the conversation. Words like consequences and examples drifted through the phone speaker, each one making Jake's face grow paler. When he finally hung up, he stood frozen for several minutes, staring at the wall as if he could see through it to some distant horizon. Then he turned to Maria Elena with eyes that held the flat desperation of a cornered rat. We're leaving for your grandmother's place tonight, he announced. Pack whatever you need for a few days. Tonight? Maria Elena tried to keep her voice neutral. But it's already getting dark and the roads through the mountains. I don't care about the damn roads. Jake exploded, sweeping a lamp off the side table. It crashed to the floor, scattering pieces of ceramic across the worn carpet. We're going tonight, and you're going to convince that old woman to sell her land. Or things are going to get very ugly very fast. Maria Elena nodded slowly, her mind racing through the plans she had been carefully laying. She had hoped for more time, but perhaps this was better. The darkness would be her ally, and she knew those mountain roads far better than Jake did. I'll pack, she said quietly, as she moved through the bedroom, gathering clothes and toiletries. Her fingers found the small items her grandmother had given her. The arrowhead went into her bra, its sharp point a constant reminder against her skin. The remaining protective herbs went into a small bag tucked inside her jacket pocket. Everything else, her identification, the small amount of money she had been secretly saving, the bus schedules she had memorized was already hidden in places Jake would never think to look. The drive began in tense silence, Jake's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He'd been drinking before they left. She could smell it on him, but his fear seemed to be keeping him relatively focused. Classical music played softly from the radio, a strange counterpoint to the violence she could feel building in the cab of the truck. As they climbed into the mountains, the familiar red rock formations rose around them like ancient guardians. Maria Elena felt a strange calm settling over her, as if the landscape itself was welcoming her home. She began to point out landmarks, ostensibly to help Jake navigate but really to center herself in the geography of her childhood. That's Spider Rock, she said, indicating a towering spire of sandstone that seemed to pierce the darkening sky. My grandmother told me stories about that place. She said it's where Spider Grandmother taught our people to weave. Jake glanced at the formation dismissively. Looks like a bunch of rocks to me. But Maria Elena could see more than rocks. In the twilight, the ancient stone seemed alive with memory and purpose. She remembered sitting by Ayana's fire as a child, listening to stories about how Spider Grandmother had given the Apache people not just the knowledge of weaving, but the understanding that all things in the universe were connected by invisible threads. Pull one thread and everything else would shift. Tonight, she was going to pull a very important thread. As they wound deeper into the mountains, Jake's agitation grew. He kept checking his phone even though there was no signal out here. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and he kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Tell me again about your grandmother's property, he demanded. How much land does she own exactly? About 40 acres, Maria Elena replied. But it's not just the land, Jake. There are sacred sites, burial grounds. The Apache Nation would never allow it to be developed. Money talks louder than tradition, Jake snarled, especially to desperate old women living alone in the middle of nowhere. Something cold and sharp settled in Maria Elena's chest. The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he spoke about her grandmother as if she were just an obstacle to be removed, crystallized everything she had been feeling for months. This man didn't just hurt her, he was a poison that destroyed everything he touched. They reached Ayana's house just after 9 o'clock. The windows glowed warmly in the darkness, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line toward the star-filled sky. It looked peaceful, safe, like a haven from the harsh world beyond. Jake parked the truck with aggressive precision, the headlights sweeping across the familiar garden before going dark. Remember what I told you, he said, his voice low and threatening. You convince her to sell or I will, and my way involves a lot more pain for everyone. The front door opened before they could knock, just as it had the last time. But something was different about Ayana tonight. She wore a traditional dress, her silver hair braided with feathers and small bones that caught the porch light. Her dark eyes seemed to hold depths that hadn't been there before, as if she had been preparing for this moment just as much as Maria Elena had. "You have returned," she said simply, her gaze moving between them with unsettling intensity. "We need to talk," Jake said, pushing past Maria Elena to position himself aggressively in front of the older woman. "About your land." Ayana nodded slowly. "Yes, I thought that might be why you came. Please, come inside. The desert has been whispering of trouble coming from the east." They followed her into the house, and Maria Elena immediately noticed changes. The usual warm, welcoming atmosphere had been replaced by something more formal, more ceremonial. Candles burned in places where electric lights usually glowed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of burning sage was strong in the air, and Maria Elena could hear the faint sound of wind chimes despite the still night. "Sit," Ayana commanded, gesturing to the couch. Her voice carried an authority that made even Jake hesitate. "Look, Mrs. Whitehorse," Jake began, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm going to be direct with you. I need money and you have something I can sell. Sign over your land to me and everyone walks away happy. And if I refuse?" Ayana's voice was calm, almost curious. Jake's mask slipped, revealing the desperate animal beneath. "Then you might have some accidents. Old people living alone, anything could happen. A fire, a fall, maybe some wild animals get into the house. Who knows?" The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind chimes outside seemed to still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Maria Elena felt the arrowhead against her skin grow warm, and something ancient stirred in her blood. Ayana smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Ah," she said softly. "So you are the coyote the spirits warned me about, the one who brings death and chaos wherever he goes." "Cut the mystical crap, old lady," Jake snapped, pulling out his phone. "I've got people who will be here in an hour if I don't call them off. People who won't be as nice as I'm being. Call them," Ayana said calmly. "The desert is hungry, and it has been a long time since it tasted the blood of those who threaten the innocent." Jake stared at her, clearly unsettled by her complete lack of fear. He looked to Maria Elena for support, expecting to see the usual cowering compliance. Instead, he found her standing straighter than she had in months, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like obsidian mirrors. "Maria, tell your crazy grandmother what happens if she doesn't cooperate," he demanded. Maria Elena took a deep breath, feeling the strength of 1,000 generations flowing through her veins. When she spoke, her voice carried echoes of her great-great-grandmother Nalnish, of all the warrior women who had never surrendered. "No, Jake," she said quietly. "I think it's time someone told you what happens when you threaten an Apache woman on her own land." The transformation in the room was instantaneous. The shadows seemed to deepen and shift. The candle flames danced despite the absence of any breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote began to howl. Jake's face went pale as he realized that the game had suddenly changed, and he was no longer the one holding all the cards. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, carrying with it the whispers of ancient spirits and the promise of justice long delayed. The wind that rose around Ayana's house carried more than just desert dust and the scent of sage. It carried the voices of ancestors, the memory of warriors who had walked this land for countless generations, and the patience of stones that had watched empires rise and fall. Jake Morrison, in his desperation and cruelty, had awakened something far older and more dangerous than he could comprehend. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" Jake demanded, his voice cracking as he looked between Maria Elena and her grandmother. "This is business, not some supernatural nonsense." Ayana moved to the mantelpiece and picked up a small clay bowl filled with what looked like ordinary dirt. But Maria Elena knew better. It was earth from the sacred mountains, blessed by medicine women and charged with protective power. "You speak of business," Ayana said, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. "But you do not understand the laws that govern this place. You think because you carry papers and threats that you own what cannot be owned." She sprinkled a small amount of the earth into her palm and blew it gently toward Jake. The dust hung in the air, longer than physics should have allowed, forming strange patterns in the candlelight before finally settling. Jake stumbled backward, coughing and wiping at his eyes. "What did you just do to me?" "I showed you the truth," Ayana replied calmly. This land knows every person who walks upon it. It remembers their intentions, their actions, their hearts, and it judges accordingly. Maria Elena watched Jake's face grow pale as he began to understand that he was no longer dealing with a frightened young woman and a helpless old lady. The arrowhead against her chest seemed to pulse with warmth, and she felt connected to something vast and eternal, something that had been protecting this family long before she was born. The spirits have been watching you. Coyote, Ayana continued, using the traditional term for a trickster who brought chaos and destruction. They have seen how you treat their daughter, how you twist love into chains, how you use fear as a weapon. They are not pleased. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming text, and he grabbed it desperately, as if contact with the outside world could restore his sense of control. But as he read the message, his face went from pale to gray. No, 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 he muttered, frantically typing a response. This can't be happening. What is it? Maria Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. My contact, the guy who was supposed to bring backup. Jake's hands shook as he held the phone. His car broke down 50 miles from here. Engine just died for no reason. He's stranded. Ayana smiled, and in that smile was the satisfaction of a spider watching a fly struggle in its web. The desert protects its own, she said simply. Those who come here with evil in their hearts often find that their machines fail them. Their plans fall apart. Their luck runs out. The wind outside grew stronger, howling around the house with voices that sounded almost human. The candle flames danced wildly but never went out, and shadows moved on the walls in patterns that defied explanation. Jake backed toward the door, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. This is insane. You're both crazy. I'm getting out of here. The door is behind you, Ayana said pleasantly, but you should know that the desert at night can be very dangerous for those who don't know its ways. There are cliffs that appear suddenly in the darkness, ravines that swallow the unwary, creatures that hunt by the light of the moon. Are you threatening me? I am offering you a choice, Ayana replied. You can stay here until morning, safe but watched, and then leave this place forever. Or you can venture into the darkness and take your chances with whatever waits out there. Jake's eyes darted between the two women, calculating odds and possibilities. He was trapped and they all knew it. His backup wasn't coming. His phone had no signal. And his truck was parked in front of a house that suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a prison. There's a third option, Maria Elena said quietly, stepping forward. The transformation in her was complete now, the cowering victim replaced by something fierce and uncompromising. You can face the consequences of everything you've done. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. What are you going to do, call the cops? Out here with no cell service. By the time anyone gets here, you'll both be. He never finished the sentence. The words died in his throat as Maria Elena pulled the ancient arrowhead from beneath her shirt, holding it up so that it caught the candlelight. The obsidian blade seemed to drink in the light and reflect it back as something darker, more primal. This belonged to Nalnish, she said, her voice steady and strong. My great-great-grandmother, who was never captured, never broken, never defeated. She taught her daughters that sometimes the only way to stop a mad dog is to put it down. The threat was clear, but it wasn't the weapon that made Jake step back in terror. It was the look in Maria Elena's eyes, the way she held herself, the sudden realization that the woman he had been abusing for months was capable of violence he had never imagined. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. Am I? Maria Elena moved closer, and Jake could see nothing in her expression but cold determination. You've threatened to kill my grandmother, the woman who raised me, who taught me everything important I know about strength and survival. You've hurt me more times than I can count, broken my ribs, given me bruises I had to hide from the world. You've isolated me from my family, my culture, my own sense of self. With each word, she took another step forward, and Jake retreated until his back was against the door. But the worst thing you did, Maria Elena continued, was make me forget who I am. You made me believe I was weak, helpless, worthless. You made me think I deserved the pain you gave me. The arrowhead caught the light again, and Jake could see his own terrified reflection in its polished surface. I remember now, she said softly. I remember that I am the granddaughter of medicine women and the descendant of warriors. I remember that my people survived genocide, forced relocation and cultural destruction because we never forgot how to fight. And I remember that some fights are worth everything you have to give. Ayana watched the confrontation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited a long time to see justice done. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and in its voice were the songs of ancient women who had faced down cavalry charges and government agents, who had protected their families against impossible odds. Jake's hand fumbled for the door handle behind him, but it wouldn't turn. He twisted and pulled, panic growing in his eyes as he realized he was truly trapped. The door will open when the spirits decide you've learned what you need to learn, Ayana said calmly. Until then, you are a guest in this house, subject to its laws and its justice. The night was far from over, and Jake Morrison was about to discover that there are some forces in the world that cannot be bullied, bribed, or broken, forces that had been waiting patiently for their moment to strike, as inevitable and merciless as the desert wind. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to wash away the terrors of the night. Jake Morrison sat slumped in the corner of Ayana's living room, his face haggard and his eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. He had not slept, had barely moved, spending the long, dark hours watching the two Apache women who had so completely turned the tables on his carefully laid plans. The night had been filled with sounds he couldn't explain. Footsteps on the roof when no one could have climbed up there. Whispers in a language he didn't recognize coming from empty rooms. The sensation of being watched by invisible eyes, judged by unseen presences. Every time he had tried to force the door, it had remained sealed shut, as if the house itself refused to let him leave. Maria Elena sat by the window, the ancient arrowhead still clutched in her hand, watching the sunrise transform the landscape from mysterious shadow into familiar beauty. She felt different, as if the night had burned away the last traces of the frightened woman she had been and revealed the warrior she was meant to become. Ayana moved through the house with quiet efficiency, preparing breakfast as if hosting a violent man who had threatened to kill her was nothing more than an inconvenience. She hummed an old Apache song under her breath, the melody weaving through the morning air like a prayer of gratitude. "The door will open now," she announced casually, not looking at Jake. "The spirits have finished with you." Jake stumbled to his feet and lunged for the door, twisting the handle frantically. This time it turned easily, swinging open to reveal the peaceful morning landscape. But instead of rushing through it to freedom, he hesitated, looking back at the two women with an expression of confused terror. "I don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "What did you do to me?" "We showed you the truth," Maria Elena replied, standing and walking to face him. In the morning light, she looked taller somehow, more substantial, as if the night had added weight to her presence. "We showed you what happens when you threaten people who are under the protection of something older and stronger than your anger." Jake's hand went to his pocket, where his phone buzzed with incoming messages. As he read them, his face grew even paler. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The guys I owe money to, they're all in jail. Arrested last night in coordinated raids. Federal charges." Ayana smiled as she set plates on the table. "The desert winds carry many messages. Sometimes they reach the right ears at the right time. You called the FBI. But there's no cell service out here." "There are older forms of communication than electronic signals," the old woman said calmly. "Our people have been sending messages across great distances for thousands of years." Maria Elena walked to where Jake stood trembling in the doorway. "Your debts are gone," she said quietly. "The men who threatened you are facing decades in prison. You're free to leave and start over somewhere else. But," she added, her voice growing hard as winterstone, "if you ever come back here, if you ever try to contact me or my grandmother again, if you ever even think about hurting another woman the way you hurt me, the spirits will know, and next time they won't be so merciful." Jake stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the strength he had spent months trying to destroy. The woman before him was not the broken victim he had created, but something ancient and dangerous, connected to forces he could never understand or control. "Take your truck and drive away," Maria Elena continued. "Don't stop until you reach a city, preferably one very far from here. Find a job, find a therapist, find some way to become a better person than you've been. Because if you don't, the desert will remember you, and it has a very long memory." Without another word, Jake stumbled outside and half ran to his pickup truck. His hands shook as he started the engine, and he didn't look back as he drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that was quickly scattered by the morning wind. Maria Elena and Ayana stood on the porch, watching until the truck disappeared around a bend in the mountain road. Only then did Maria Elena allow herself to truly breathe, feeling the last of the tension that had lived in her body for months finally release. "It's over," she said, barely believing the words. "This part is over," Ayana corrected gently, "but your real journey is just beginning." They spent the morning sitting in the garden sharing stories and drinking tea made from herbs that grew wild in the sacred mountains. Maria Elena told her grandmother about the months of abuse, the fear, the gradual erosion of her sense of self. Ayana listened without judgment, her weathered hands holding her granddaughter's as the healing began. "I want to stay here for a while," Maria Elena said as the sun climbed higher in the sky. "I need to remember who I am when I'm not afraid." "This house has always been yours as much as mine," Ayana replied. "Your room is exactly as you left it years ago." That afternoon, Maria Elena called the women's shelter where she had volunteered before meeting Jake, explaining that she was ready to return to work. She called her old friends, the ones Jake had forced her to abandon, and began the slow process of rebuilding the connections he had severed. In the evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayana brought out the family photo albums. They looked through generations of Apache women who had faced their own challenges, their own moments of testing. Warriors, medicine women, artists, teachers, mothers who had passed down strength and wisdom through times of hardship and change. "See this?" Ayana pointed to a photograph of a young woman standing proudly beside a traditional dwelling. "This was my grandmother, your great-great-great-grandmother. She survived the forced march to the reservation, raised 7 children during the worst years of government suppression, and lived to be 93. She used to say that Apache women are like the desert plants that survive by putting down deep roots and storing strength for the hard seasons." Maria Elena traced the face in the photograph with her finger, seeing her own features reflected across the generations. "I lost sight of my roots," she admitted. "I let someone convince me that my heritage was worthless, that I was worthless." "The roots were always there," Ayana said softly. "Sometimes they just need the right conditions to grow strong again." 3 months later, Maria Elena stood before a group of young women at the tribal community center, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. She wore traditional Apache dress for the first time in years, her grandmother's turquoise jewelry catching the light as she spoke. "Abuse doesn't happen all at once," she told them. "It creeps in slowly like erosion wearing away at a cliff face. One day you look around and realize that the person you used to be has been carved away piece by piece, until you don't recognize yourself anymore." She touched the arrowhead that now hung openly around her neck, no longer hidden but worn with pride. "But you are stronger than any force that tries to diminish you. You carry the blood of survivors, the wisdom of generations, the protection of ancestors who never gave up. Remember that. Hold on to that. And when the time comes to fight for your life, for your dignity, for your future, remember that you are not alone." The wind through the open windows carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of traditional drums. In the audience, young women nodded with understanding, their own fires of determination kindling in their eyes. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under the vast sky, patient and eternal, keeping its ancient promises to protect those who remembered how to call upon its power. The night-blooming Sirius would flower again when its time came, brief and beautiful and utterly unashamed. And in a small house where the old traditions lived on, an Apache grandmother smiled as she watched her granddaughter teach others what it meant to bloom with fierce pride under the light of 1,000 stars.